Okay, so we have this controversial president on the $20 bill that, there's a lot of talk about, was he a great president or not? And we're going to look at, his presidency and this Jacksonian Democracy and its effect on the political and social sectionalism that is occurring in the United States. But before we do it, we should probably give a little background for Jackson. Ephraim, where's this guy born?
Well, Jackson was born near Lancaster in South Carolina in 1767. His dad died when he was about 29, just 3 weeks before he was born. Jackson, his mother, and his brothers lived with Jackson's aunt and uncle in the Waxhaws region, and Jackson received schooling from 2 nearby priests. He fought in the Revolutionary War when he was only 13 alongside his brothers.
I think he's actually the only president to have fought in 2 wars prior to being president. Well, 13 years is a little young to be fighting a war, but yeah. Go on, what's up?
Well, his oldest brother, Hugh, died from a heat stroke during the war, and so Andrew and his brother Robert were eventually captured by the British, where they contracted smallpox. His mother made an exchange to free the both of them, but Robert soon died to the illness while Andrew survived. At this point, he was the only son still, and his mother volunteered to be a nurse, but then later died to cholera, making him the only one left in the family. Jackson raised himself up independently, influencing how he would act in the future. So when he was 17, he became an attorney, sparking his career into politics and eventually the presidency. Definitely
a different time period. You can be an attorney at 17, but yeah. Jackson kind of doing it on his own and facing the adversity he faced. I think that's going to become kind of a nucleus of his campaign, this common man, this I wasn't born with anything, I struggled and I did it all myself, and that's kind of what America is, with the American dream. So let's fast forward to when he was about 45 years old and the War of 1812 breaks out.
Yeah, well, like you said, he was 45 in the War of 1812, and then after the war, Jackson emerged as a rising star in the political arena because he was seen as a hero during the war. He was heavily outnumbered when the British invaded, not the Beatles, but it began on December 14th, where Jackson's forces were heavily outnumbered. On January 8th, the British launched a full-scale attack on Jackson's forces, and to the amazement of the world, Jackson's army handed the British, which was probably the strongest power of the time, just destroyed them, crushed them, and that eventually led to the end of the War of 1812.
I think that was the Battle of New Orleans, and if I'm remembering correct, that battle actually happened after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed.
Yeah.
So, here we are thinking that the war's over, and then a surprise attack and standing in the way and ultimately leading to the victory is Jackson. So we can see why he's going to come out of here as a shining star. And it's probably important to point out that most of the revolutionary heroes that fought, like your Washington, your Jefferson, and Madison, had died at this point. So the country's kind of thirsting for the new war hero leader. All right, so then we move over. Now, fast forward, Jackson's a rising star. The war's over. James Monroe had a successful campaign, and Jackson's ready to take the country in a direction that's going to be, more representative of what most of the public is, which is what he was, this common person who didn't really have anything given to him. He did it all on his own. So let's talk about this period of Jacksonian democracy.
Well, during Jacksonian democracy, it was a large period of change, mainly through increased voter participation. So Jack put himself as the common man, and running in politics, that was like how he represented himself, so a lot of people were going to vote for that. And eventually the federal government would be the ones making the changes, not so much the states. So a lot of power is going from states towards the federal government, regardless of what region of the country they were making changes. And after Jackson represented himself as the common man, mainly due to the way how he was risen, the struggles in his early life. A lot of people went behind that, and he was a leader that shared similar background to the growth of broad coalition of Americans from all over the country. Americans were hopeful that a true representative of the people would implement fair and just policies, thus unifying a seemingly fractured people.
It's kind of funny, though, the idea of a common man. We look at some of the people that are running for power today. President Trump's going to be running for re-election. You have Michael Bloomberg. These are all billionaires, so they champion common man causes, but most of them have never lived or walked in the shoes of a common man. So it's it's always interesting to see how they try to relate to the people. But Jackson actually did walk in those shoes, so it's probably the reason why he had such this magnetism toward him. But anyway, what's going on with Jacksonian democracy?
Well, Jackson, much as the rich people would do this with our presidents today, the wealthy presidents, Jackson being poor and a common man, he pinned the poor against the rich. So he wasn't so much democratic by pushing an aggressive federal agenda, but he was exploiting the class warfare between the rich and the poor. Many people believe that this helped move us down the road of embedded sectionalism and eventually the Civil War. So by doing this, he was really splitting the United States between poor and rich without a middle ground. And in his inaugural address, he stated, "A just respect for states' rights and the maintenance of state sovereignty as the best check of the tendencies to consolidation."
So I think he's referring to, here's a guy that's like not only presenting himself as a man of the people, he's also kind of this presenting himself as pro-states' rights. He's against the consolidation of power and the strong federal government, not much like the Federalists were and the Whigs. So he's really trying to be this guy who's going to kind of keep everyone in check and fight the power of the federal government, fight the power of the special interest groups, which is definitely a noble cause. But what happens when Jackson actually gets power?
Well, when Jackson gets power, the South was really for him because of this states' rights idea, but this honeymoon period, as it was called, would end with a tariff that really affected the South deeply. Deemed the tariff of abominations, Southern states threatened nullification and even potentially seceding from the country in response. President Jackson threatened, "But if one drop of blood is shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find."
See, I think that's kind of a clear indicator of what power does to the individual, and a testament to Jackson's temperament on the job. He's supposed to be the common man and the guy who's fighting against the federal government, but that only works if you go along with what he says. So now he finds himself actually exercising the power of the federal government on people who question his leadership.
Yeah, Jackson, in order to make his point to those southern states, he used the Force Act and threatened military action if the South did not fall in line. This was well known in South Carolina when they threatened to nullify a federal law, and Jackson threatened to use the army if they were to secede.
Yeah, I think he had that letter to Lewis Class, and I think he vowed to crush the monster in its cradle before it matures to manhood, which is kind of an odd thing to say. It sounds like something you'd see in Game of Thrones, but apparently this is what Jackson's imagining in his mind, kind of like a Don Quixote moment, right? Windmills are monsters, and Jackson thinks that anyone who questions his way is a monster. Okay, so so Jackson's going to pass the Force Act. He's going to push his belief on others, and you see that this really didn't sit well, right? Because in 1835, this guy Richard Lawrence is going to attempt to assassinate Jackson, right? Lawrence was an unemployed painter. He was found not guilty because of reason of insanity, but he's going to spend the rest of his life in life asylum. So poor Lawrence didn't do too well after that. But still, Americans were kind of expressing their frustration with Jackson's leadership, and they're going to nickname him King Andrew. And there's that political cartoon which circulates. You see Jackson is displayed sporting a king's attire, a scepter. He's holding a veto, and he's stepping on the Constitution. All right, so you see politically Jackson's kind of driving a further wedge with the sectional divide, and he's almost exploited it to get power, but now he's definitely exercising the opposite, which is concerning. So what else? Well, let's talk about the social sectionalism.
Well, Jackson championed that he would later be known as populist causes, promising to restore the principles of the Constitution and live by the words in the Declaration of Independence, believing that all men are created equal. Considering how the country was going at the time, Jackson was getting a lot of support, and he was eventually running for president in 1824. There was no clear winner in the election, so the decision went to the House of Representatives, where Speaker of the House Henry Clay basically handed the election to John Quincy Adams, which Jackson would call the corrupt bargain. And he would use this event as a rallying cry and basically evidence that the American government was corrupted, which would basically help him win the election of 1828. This is similar to President Trump's promise to drain the swamp. Jackson promised to do the same. Jackson promised to get rid of corruption within the government. And with the expanded suffrage to all the white males and a fired up base, Jackson won a resounding victory in the election of 1828.
Yeah, so Jackson's going to have to prove his point right away, and I think that's what this spoil system is about, right? He's going to go in there, and he's going to fire 10% of the government officers that held power. Mainly, they're going to be John Quincy Adams leftovers, and just kind of clear it out because he says that they're there to sabotage his work as bringing rights and justice to the people. So it's clear Jackson's riding this wave of populist cries for justice, and he's promising to do it. And by this demonstration of the spoil system, he's doing it. But in reality, he's really doing actually carrying out the crimes that he criticized the government for carrying out, which is special privilege, hooking people up, and that's definitely not going to sit well. I think he even had this kitchen cabinet where he had these informal cabinet meetings in the kitchen of the White House to prove how much of a common guy he is, and he has really no taste for the nice fine suits and the fancy talk and the fancy venues for his decisions that the country's going to have to make. So, and then I think Jackson even had some fun with pitting the rich versus the poor. The majority of America was poor, illiterate. Public schools really weren't a thing. They were a little more common in the North because of how religiously, devout they were. So literacy was kind of needed to read the Bible and to teach. But if you look throughout the country, there wasn't a real solid program to get people on there. And Jackson's going to kind of take advantage of that. So one of the last things he does is he goes on this war against the National Bank. Second National Bank is it's up for a charter, and he refuses to renew the charter for the bank. The Republicans, or Whigs rather, at this point, to try to use this as a political chip and embarrass Jackson. They're trying to push this before the election of 1832, and it happens, and Jackson wins a resounding victory and kills the bank. He said, "See, you guys tried embarrassing me. I won the election, and now I'm really killing the bank." And he's going to take the money out of the federal bank and distribute it to what they call pet banks. And that doesn't do too well for the next guy, Martin Van Buren, as he is going to inherit a pretty bad economic scene. There's a depression, and that's going to seal the fate and make Martin Van Buren a one-term president. But in terms of going back to Jackson's idea that he's going to live by the Constitution, that all men are created equal, even socially, what's going on with this guy?
Well, Jackson actually did very little in the social aspect of his career. He didn't really expand the rights of African American slaves or women. And even though reform movements were inspired by these ideas of equality, which ultimately brought him to the White House, Jackson was accused of being racist, sexist, and a bigot. There were limits to the degree of his principles he championed, and perhaps that had to do with the time period rather than his failure as an individual.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the things. When we look back at some of these political figures, and we're telling the truth, we're realizing that he's racist, sexist, and a bigot. When you look at the landscape back then, there was a lot of misinformation or just lack of education. So you did see that was, he might have been a product of his environment, and that's not an excuse for the guy, but it adds perspective and a little context as we start pointing this out. But Jackson certainly proved not to be a good guy based off of some of his actions. You don't threaten Americans with the military. But anyway, so one thing is for certain. What's that?
The one thing that is most factual is that Andrew Jackson was severely changed by the power of the office. He really abused the power, such as the nullification crisis. He threatened to use the military, and his shortcomings and unchecked temperament threatened the system of separation of powers and checks and balances. The country would eventually be more divided when he left the office rather than when he first entered.
Yeah, so this guy's throwing out vetoes like life rafts in the Titanic. That's a terrible joke, but Jackson himself, he's going to defy the Supreme Court, and all of a sudden, John Marshall's going to rule and say, "Hey, Cherokee Indians, you can hang out and stay." And Jackson said, "Yeah, thanks, John, for your decision, but I'm sending the military down there." So he was going to push this Indian Removal Act, which ultimately leads to the Trail of Tears, this 116-day march of Cherokee Indians, where they're going to get dumped on the other side of the Mississippi, and it's going to lead to tragedy and just, again, demonstrating his ignorance and lack of tolerance for Native Americans. So when we look back on Jackson, we have to evaluate his Jacksonian Democracy, and I think the positive aspects of Andrew Jackson on the country politically and socially in terms of sectionalism had little to do with his leadership and more to do with the hope surrounding his candidacy. His candidacy was supposed to basically right these wrongs and unify. When Jackson leaves the country, it's even more damaged, and economically, that's really going to kind of keep the peace in the country. If the economy's good, people are going to find ways to put up with some of the leadership shortcomings. But if the economy's bad, it's going to help amplify and highlight the political and sectional social divisiveness that this guy really put forth on the United States. So that's about it for Jackson. I hope this review winds up helping you guys. And if you have any other further questions, you know where to go. You're going to call, we'll call, email, or just stop them in the hall. Ephraim and Bryce Reimer, the valid Victorian, and Big Ephraim, number 4. And these guys know a good deal, so they'll be happy to tutor you in their spare time. All right, have a good day.